Your hormones are communicating right now, and the signals they are sending are far more specific, far more readable, and far more clinically significant than most people have ever been told. Hormones are not simply the chemicals that govern reproduction and mood. They are the body's primary long-range communication system, molecular messengers produced by glands throughout the body that travel through the bloodstream and regulate virtually every physiological process that keeps you alive and functional. Your metabolic rate, your sleep architecture, your cardiovascular risk, your cognitive clarity, your immune responsiveness, your capacity to build and maintain muscle, the condition of your skin and hair, the stability of your mood across a day, all of these are downstream expressions of a hormonal system that is either operating in balance or progressively drifting out of it. The problem is that hormonal imbalance does not announce itself with a single clear symptom. It announces itself through a diffuse pattern of changes distributed across multiple body systems simultaneously, changes that are individually easy to dismiss and collectively almost never presented to the public as a recognizable whole. Unexplained weight gain around the abdomen that resists dietary change, hair that has gradually become thinner, a persistent fatigue that is present on waking and does not resolve across the day, sleep that is technically adequate but not restorative, a libido that has quietly diminished without obvious explanation, a mood that has become less stable, more reactive, and harder to regulate than it was 5 years ago. None of these changes are inevitable. None of them are simply what getting older feels like. Each one has a specific hormonal mechanism behind it, and most of them are highly responsive to intervention once you understand what is actually driving them. That is precisely what this video is going to show you. Not a list of symptoms, but a biological explanation for why each one appears, what it tells you about the underlying hormonal system, and what the evidence says you can do about it. Hi, I'm Dr. Alex. I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and after nearly 10 years in the AANDE, I have seen the downstream consequences of unrecognized hormonal imbalance across virtually every organ or system, from the cardiovascular crises driven by decades of unmanaged thyroid dysfunction and insulin resistance, to the bone fractures in patients whose estrogen and testosterone levels had been declining untreated for years. Hormonal imbalance is not a niche concern. It is one of the most prevalent and most underinvestigated categories of chronic health disruption in adults over 40. My goal is to give you the biological literacy to recognize it, understand it, and act on it before it produces the downstream consequences I see at the far end of the trajectory. If you are watching this video, you are almost certainly someone who has noticed changes in your body or your mental functioning that have not been adequately explained by the standard answers you have been given. I want to make you a direct promise. I will keep creating the most rigorously researched and clearly explained content I can, content that goes substantially deeper than a standard clinical appointment allows, grounded in the science and the clinical experience that actually changes how people understand their health. All I ask in return is that you give this channel a genuine chance and hit the subscribe button right now. If you reach the end of this video and feel you have not learned anything meaningfully new, please unsubscribe, no hard feelings. But if you give me your time and attention, I will give you everything I have learned from a decade on the front line of medicine. Please hit subscribe, help this channel reach more people who need it, and let us get into it. To understand why hormonal imbalance produces the specific signs it does, we need to understand how the hormonal system is structured, because it is not a collection of independent glands producing independent chemicals. It is a deeply interconnected network of feedback loops in which every hormone influences the production, sensitivity, and metabolism of several others. Disrupting one part of the network creates ripple effects across the whole system, which is why hormonal imbalance almost always presents as multiple symptoms across multiple body systems, rather than a single isolated complaint. The master regulator of the hormonal system is the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the same brain-based command system we discussed in the context of the stress response. The hypothalamus produces releasing hormones that signal the pituitary gland to release stimulating hormones, which in turn signal the peripheral endocrine glands, the thyroid, the adrenals, the gonads to produce their respective hormones. These peripheral hormones then travel through the bloodstream to their target tissues, and they also feed back to the hypothalamus and pituitary to regulate their own production. This architecture, hypothalamus pituitary peripheral gland target tissue feedback, is repeated for every major hormonal axis in the body, and it means that disruption can enter the system at any level and produce downstream effects that may not obviously point to their origin. The 5 hormonal systems most relevant to the signs we are about to discuss are the thyroid axis, the insulin and metabolic axis, the sex hormone axis covering testosterone and estrogen, the cortisol and adrenal axis, and the growth hormone and IGF-1 axis. These 5 systems are deeply interdependent. Chronic insulin resistance impairs thyroid hormone conversion. Elevated cortisol suppresses sex hormone production. Declining sex hormones reduce insulin sensitivity. Impaired growth hormone secretion accelerates the fat accumulation that drives insulin resistance. They operate as a network, and the most common clinical picture in adults over 45 with hormonal imbalance involves not one of these axes functioning poorly in isolation, but several of them simultaneously drifting in the same direction, each one amplifying the dysfunction of the others. The standard hormonal investigations offered in routine medical care are thyroid-stimulating hormone level, a fasting glucose, occasional sex hormone measurements. If symptoms are sufficiently obvious, represent a narrow and incomplete picture of a system whose health depends on the interactions between dozens of hormones, their binding proteins, their receptor sensitivities, and their diurnal rhythms. A TSH level within the reference range does not confirm that thyroid hormone is acting adequately at the cellular level. A testosterone level within the broad population range does not confirm that the level is adequate for that individual. A fasting glucose within the normal range does not rule out significant insulin resistance in the post-meal hours when most of the metabolic damage accumulates. What makes this particularly important is that the reference ranges used to define hormonal normality are statistical constructs derived from population averages, not biological targets optimized for health. When the majority of the population over 50 is metabolically compromised, living with suboptimal sleep, and carrying levels of chronic stress that suppress multiple hormonal axes simultaneously, the average becomes a poor guide to what is optimal. Recognizing the signs of hormonal imbalance is therefore not about identifying dramatic deficiencies that fall outside these ranges. It is about recognizing the pattern of systemic functional changes that indicate the network is operating below its sustainable range, even when the individual numbers appear acceptable on paper. Here are the 11 signs that your hormones may be out of balance, each one explained through the specific hormonal mechanism that produces it, so that you understand not just what you are experiencing, but what the signal means and which part of the hormonal network it is pointing toward. Abdominal fat accumulation that resists dietary effort is one of the most reliable indicators of hormonal disruption in adults over 40, and it is produced by a convergence of several hormonal shifts occurring simultaneously. Declining estrogen in women after perimenopause alters fat distribution, shifting it from the peripheral pattern of the hips and thighs toward the central, visceral pattern associated with cardiovascular and metabolic risk. Declining testosterone in men reduces the metabolic rate and the capacity to maintain lean muscle mass, increasing the proportion of caloric intake converted to fat storage. Chronically elevated cortisol, through its direct stimulation of visceral adipocyte differentiation, specifically promotes fat deposition in the abdominal region. And insulin resistance, which both causes and is worsened by visceral fat accumulation, creates a hormonal environment in which fat mobilization is chronically suppressed and fat storage is chronically promoted. The critical clinical point is that this pattern does not respond to caloric restriction alone, because caloric restriction is not the primary driver. The hormonal environment is addressing the weight without addressing the hormonal dysfunction that is creating it, is the most common reason that dietary efforts in this demographic fail to produce the expected results. Fatigue that is present immediately upon waking, before any physical or cognitive effort has been expended, is a specific hormonal signal that is distinct from the fatigue produced by insufficient sleep. The cortisol awakening response, the sharp healthy spike in cortisol that occurs in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking and provides the biological energy, morning alertness and function, is blunted or absent in individuals with adrenal axis dysregulation. Simultaneously, thyroid hormone deficiency, even at subclinical levels, reduces the metabolic rate of every cell in the body, including the brain and cardiac muscle, producing a pervasive energy deficit that is present regardless of rest and does not resolve across the day. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism demonstrated that even subclinical hypothyroidism, defined as an elevated TSH with normal free T4, the stage at which most guidelines do not recommend treatment, was associated with measurably reduced energy expenditure, exercise tolerance, and cognitive performance in adults over 50. Fatigue on waking that has been present for months without improvement, particularly in conjunction with cold sensitivity, weight changes, and mood alterations, should always prompt thorough thyroid and adrenal assessment rather than simply attribution to poor sleep or aging. Hair follicles are exquisitely sensitive to the hormonal environment, and the pattern of hair loss provides specific diagnostic information about which hormonal system is disrupted. Diffuse thinning across the entire scalp rather than the receding hairline pattern of androgenetic alopecia is a characteristic sign of thyroid dysfunction, particularly hypothyroidism, in which reduced metabolic activity impairs the anagen phase of the hair growth cycle, producing widespread shedding. Hair loss at the outer third of the eyebrows is a classical, if often overlooked, clinical sign of thyroid deficiency. Testosterone and its more potent derivative dihydrotestosterone, DHT, produced by the enzyme 5-alpha reductase, drives the scalp hair follicle miniaturization of androgenetic alopecia in genetically susceptible individuals of both sexes. Oestrogen, which in women partially counteracts DHT's action on the follicle, provides a degree of protection that is lost during perimenopause, explaining why hair thinning often accelerates in the perimenopausal period, independently of any genetic predisposition. The clinical implication is that hair changes in midlife should be evaluated as potential hormonal signals, not simply attributed to genetics or aging, particularly when they occur alongside other signs from this list. The hormonal regulation of sleep is a multi-axis process in which estrogen, progesterone, cortisol, and thyroid hormone all play specific and interdependent roles. In women approaching or traversing menopause, declining progesterone, which has direct GABA-A receptor modulating properties, producing a mild anxiolytic and sedative effect, is responsible for the difficulty initiating sleep and the increased sleep fragmentation that frequently begin years before the formal menopausal transition. Vasomotor symptoms, hot flushes and night sweats, driven by the estrogen-mediated dysregulation of hypothalamic thermoregulation, produce nocturnal awakenings that further fragment sleep architecture. In men, declining testosterone is associated with reduced sleep efficiency and increased prevalence of sleep apnea, a bidirectional relationship in which testosterone deficiency worsens apnea severity, and apnea-driven sleep fragmentation further suppresses testosterone production. Cortisol axis dysregulation, as discussed in the previous video on brain stress, disrupts sleep at both ends of the night. The clinical significance of hormonally driven sleep disruption is compounded by the fact that the hormones most disrupted by poor sleep, testosterone, growth hormone, and cortisol regulation, are precisely those whose decline is driving the sleep disturbance. It is a self-sustaining cycle, and interrupting it requires addressing the hormonal component, not simply the sleep hygiene. Reduced sexual desire is among the most consistently underreported symptoms of hormonal imbalance, in part because it is perceived as a personal matter, in part because it is widely attributed to relationship dynamics or psychological state, and in part because clinicians infrequently raise it in routine consultations. The biological reality is that libido in both men and women is primarily driven by testosterone, specifically by free testosterone, the unbound fraction that is biologically active, and its decline with age is one of the most predictable hormonal changes in the human body. In men, testosterone declines at approximately 1 to 2% per year from the age of 30, with clinical deficiency hypogonadism affecting approximately 25 to 40% of men over 60. In women, testosterone is produced in smaller but physiologically significant quantities by the ovaries and adrenal glands, and its decline through the perimenopausal transition produces a reduction in sexual desire that is distinct from and independent of the estrogen changes that produce other menopausal symptoms. Research published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine demonstrated that free testosterone levels were the strongest hormonal predictor of self-reported sexual desire in both pre- and post-menopausal women, more predictive than total testosterone, estrogen, or any other measured hormone. Attributing low libido to stress, relationship factors, or aging without investigating the hormonal substrate is one of the most common and consequential omissions in the routine clinical management of this symptom. Hormonal influences on mood operate through direct neurochemical mechanisms, not simply through the psychological experience of having hormonal symptoms. Estrogen modulates serotonin receptor sensitivity and serotonin reuptake transporter expression in the brain, producing measurable effects on mood stability, emotional reactivity, and anxiety that are bidirectionally altered by estrogen fluctuation. The mood instability of premenstrual syndrome and perimenopause is not merely psychological, it reflects direct estrogen-driven changes in serotonergic and GABAergic neurotransmission. Progesterone's GABA-A modulatory properties, which normally exert an anxiolytic effect, are lost as levels decline, contributing to the anxiety and sleep disruption that frequently accompany the perimenopausal transition. Testosterone deficiency in men produces a specific mood phenotype characterized by reduced motivation, mild dysphoria, and increased irritability that is distinct from primary depression and consistently resolves with testosterone restoration in appropriately selected patients. Thyroid hormone, which governs the metabolic rate of every cell including neurons, produces anxiety and emotional lability when elevated and depressive symptoms and cognitive slowing when deficient. The practical clinical implication is that mood changes that have emerged or worsened in midlife, particularly when they do not respond well to standard psychological approaches or antidepressant therapy, warrant comprehensive hormonal assessment before being attributed to psychological causes alone. The failure of dietary restriction to produce expected weight loss is one of the most clinically significant indicators that a hormonal driver is present and unaddressed. The metabolic rate is governed primarily by thyroid hormone, specifically triiodikefrenine, or T3, the biologically active form that regulates the rate of cellular energy expenditure in every tissue. When T3 activity is inadequate, whether from reduced thyroid production, impaired conversion of thyroxine to T3, or reduced cellular receptor sensitivity, the metabolic rate falls, caloric expenditure decreases, and the caloric deficit required to produce weight loss becomes very difficult to maintain through dietary effort alone. Insulin resistance compounds this picture by chronically suppressing lipolysis, the breakdown of stored fat for energy, creating a metabolic environment in which fat stores are physiologically locked against mobilization. Research published in obesity reviews demonstrated that dietary restriction in the context of insulin resistance produces significantly smaller weight losses per unit of caloric deficit than in insulin-sensitive individuals, not because of behavioral non-compliance, but because the metabolic machinery governing fat mobilization is hormonally impaired. The patient who is told they are not trying hard enough is in many cases simply not being given the hormonal assessment that would reveal the actual driver of their resistance. Cognitive symptoms attributable to hormonal imbalance are among the most distressing and least investigated features of endocrine disruption in midlife. The brain is a profoundly hormonally sensitive organ. Estrogen promotes synaptic density, neuroplasticity, and cerebrovascular health. Testosterone supports spatial cognition, working memory, and verbal fluency. Thyroid hormone governs the metabolic rate of neurons and the synthesis of the myelin that insulates them, and insulin mediates glucose uptake in hippocampal neurons, with insulin resistance in the brain increasingly recognized as a distinct phenomenon from peripheral insulin resistance, impairing the energy availability that memory formation requires. When several of these hormonal inputs decline simultaneously, as they characteristically do in the perimenopausal and andropausal transition, the cumulative effect on cognitive performance can be substantial. The brain fog of hormonal imbalance has a specific phenomenological character: difficulty with word retrieval, slowed information processing, reduced working memory capacity, and a sense of mental effortfulness that was previously unnecessary. Research published in Menopause demonstrated that estradiol levels were an independent predictor of verbal memory and cognitive processing speed in perimenopausal women, with verbal memory performance declining in parallel with falling estradiol before the formal onset of menopause. The condition of the skin and its appendages, hair, nails, and to some extent body hair distribution is a direct reflection of the hormonal environment, and changes in these structures in midlife carry specific diagnostic information. Thyroid hormone governs the rate of epidermal cell turnover and the production of the structural proteins, keratin, collagen, and the lipid components of the skin barrier that determine skin texture and moisture retention. Hypothyroidism produces characteristically dry, rough, and sometimes thickened skin alongside brittle nails and coarse hair through the global reduction in cellular metabolic activity that impairs the continuous renewal of these structures. Estrogen deficiency produces a distinct pattern: skin thinning, reduced collagen density, and decreased moisture retention through its specific role in stimulating dermal fibroblast activity and hyaluronic acid production. Research published in the International Journal of Dermatology demonstrated that the rate of collagen loss from skin accelerates markedly in the first 5 years after menopause, producing measurably reduced skin thickness and elasticity that are attributable to estrogen withdrawal rather than chronological aging alone. These changes are often among the earliest visible signs that the sex hormone transition has begun, and they can precede other menopausal symptoms by months or years. The hypothalamus contains the primary thermostat of the body, and its temperature-regulating function is directly modulated by several hormones, most prominently estrogen and thyroid hormone. Estrogen stabilizes the hypothalamic thermostat by narrowing the thermoneutral zone, the range of core body temperature within which the hypothalamus does not trigger a heating or cooling response. When estrogen levels decline or fluctuate, as they do in perimenopause, this thermoneutral zone narrows further or becomes unstable, producing the vasomotor symptoms of hot flushes and night sweats that affect up to 80% of women during the menopausal transition. In men, testosterone has a modulatory role in hypothalamic thermoregulation, and testosterone deficiency can produce a less dramatic but clinically real version of temperature lability. Thyroid hormone, by governing the overall metabolic rate, governs how much heat the body generates as a byproduct of cellular energy production. Hypothyroidism produces cold intolerance, a persistent inability to generate adequate body heat, while hyperthyroidism produces heat intolerance and excessive sweating through the opposite mechanism. Temperature regulation that has become unexpectedly unreliable is therefore a meaningful hormonal signal in both directions and in both sexes. Menstrual cycle irregularity is the most direct clinical window into the sex hormone axis in women of reproductive age, and its changes in the decade before menopause carry information that extends well beyond reproductive concerns. The menstrual cycle is governed by the precise orchestration of follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone, a coordinated hormonal sequence that is disrupted first, most obviously and most consistently, by any significant stress on the hypothalamic pituitary-ovarian axis. Cycle shortening, cycles becoming less than 25 days, is frequently the first sign of perimenopause, reflecting the accelerated follicular depletion that precedes the menopausal transition by up to a decade. Unusually heavy bleeding, menorrhagia, in perimenopausal women is typically driven by progesterone insufficiency in the luteal phase, producing unopposed estrogen stimulation of the endometrium. Irregular cycles associated with weight gain, facial hair growth, and difficulty conceiving point toward polycystic ovary syndrome, a condition of androgen excess and insulin resistance that affects approximately 10% of women of reproductive age and has significant long-term metabolic implications that extend far beyond its reproductive manifestations. Any significant change in menstrual pattern warrants hormonal assessment, not simply reassurance that variation is normal. If you recognize several of these signs concurrently, and the word concurrently is important because the pattern is more clinically significant than any individual sign, that convergence warrants a systematic hormonal assessment, not individual symptom management. The hormonal network does not fail one axis at a time, it drifts across multiple axes simultaneously, and addressing it requires seeing the full picture. If this is helping you see a pattern that you have been experiencing without being able to name it clearly, please take 5 seconds to hit the subscribe button. It genuinely helps this content reach more people who need it. Now let us talk about what the evidence says actually works to restore hormonal balance. I want to frame this clearly before we proceed. Hormonal imbalance exists on a spectrum from functional disruption, where lifestyle and metabolic interventions are the primary tools, to frank endocrine deficiency, where hormone replacement or pharmacological management may be the most appropriate intervention. Nothing in this section is a substitute for clinical assessment and individualized management. What it provides is the evidence base for the biological conditions that support hormonal system health and for the specific investigations that are worth requesting from your doctor based on the signs you have recognized. Restoring insulin sensitivity is the most broadly impactful single intervention for hormonal balance because insulin resistance disrupts virtually every other hormonal axis simultaneously. It impairs thyroid hormone conversion by reducing the peripheral conversion of T4 to the active T3 form. It elevates sex hormone binding globulin in unpredictable ways, altering the free fractions of testosterone and estrogen. It drives the elevated androgen production in the ovarian theca cells that underlies polycystic ovary syndrome, and it suppresses growth hormone pulsatility by chronically elevating insulin, which inhibits growth hormone release. The dietary interventions with the most consistent evidence for improving insulin sensitivity are a sustained reduction in refined carbohydrate and ultra-processed food consumption, an increase in dietary fiber diversity from whole food sources, and the timing of carbohydrate intake in ways that reduce post-meal glucose and insulin spikes with the largest carbohydrate meals earlier in the day when insulin sensitivity is at its diurnal peak. Research published in Cell Metabolism demonstrated that time-restricted eating, confining food intake to a consistent 8 to 10-hour window, aligned with the light phase of the day, produced significant improvements in insulin sensitivity, cortisol regulation, and multiple cardiometabolic markers within 12 weeks without caloric restriction. The hormonal benefits of insulin sensitivity restoration ramify across the entire endocrine network.